Welcome back to the show, everyone. Glad to have you all back with us again for our fourth deep dive into development. If you remember from our last few deep dives, we were talking about, industrialization, and it's really just massive effects on how entire countries kind of got built. Today, though, we're looking at Ha-Joon Chang's Kicking Away the Ladder, and we're going to kind of try to unpack, how exactly did these already industrialized economies, what did they do to get to where they were? And then, what do they do to make sure no one else can follow them up?
It's like winning a board game and then just like ripping up the rule book so no one else can play it the same way.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So for our listener who's maybe cracking open this book for the first time, what exactly is this ladder that Chang's talking about?
So the ladder is basically just a metaphor. It's a metaphor for this, this path to economic prosperity. And so what Chang is arguing is that all these developed nations, they all climb to the top. But they used policies like protectionism. So, they used tariffs to kind of shield their own industries, government subsidies, even like a good amount of state intervention. But then once they reach that top rung, they get up to the top. And then what do? They turn around and they start preaching free trade and limited government, which basically makes the climb like way steeper for anyone else who's trying to follow.
So it's kind of like a do as I say, not as I did kind of situation.
Exactly. Yeah, Chang really digs into this historical reality that like a lot of these economic powerhouses, the ones that we all think of today, they didn't actually play by the rules of this free market that they're now advocating for.
Okay. That's starting to make a little bit more sense.
Yeah.
But I think it's still kind of abstract. Can we get into like some specific examples of what these industrialized economies actually did to climb that ladder, in the first place?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let's take protectionism, for example. Like instead of just opening up their doors to all this foreign competition right away, a lot of countries used tariffs to make it so that imported goods were way more expensive. So it gave their own industries like a chance to kind of grow and compete. It's almost like building a greenhouse, to protect young plants until they can get strong enough to be outside.
Right. You need some time and some space.
Yeah.
To get your industries off the ground. What other tactics did they use?
Well, they definitely weren't afraid to spend money to get what they wanted. Chang highlights how many governments, they strategically invested in these key sectors, providing subsidies to help them kind of innovate and expand. It wasn't just about letting the market just do its thing. They were actively trying to shape how their economies would develop.
So it sounds like they were bending the rules a little bit.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It gets even more interesting when you consider their approach to intellectual property. Chang talks about how some countries actually encouraged kind of borrowing ideas from other more developed nations so they could speed up their own technological progress.
Hold on. Are we talking about like straight up industrial espionage here?
Not necessarily espionage, but they definitely had a much more relaxed attitude towards intellectual property rights. They saw it as a way to quickly get the knowledge they needed and then catch up to the countries who were already ahead without having to start from scratch. It's a controversial tactic for sure, but I think it shows how climbing up that ladder, it wasn't always like a totally fair game.
That's fascinating. It really makes you question, this idea that economic success is all based on merit and following the rules.
Right. It raises these questions about like, how level is the playing field really for countries that are trying to develop today?
Okay. So we've got this picture of industrialized nations kind of pulling up the ladder behind them. But Chang doesn't just talk about the theory, right? He looks at some specific cases to kind of back up his argument.
Yeah, for sure. And two of the most compelling examples are the journeys of South Korea and Taiwan.
Oh, right. Like two of the Asian tigers that, just totally dominated. But I have a feeling their stories are a lot more complicated than just embracing free markets.
You're totally right. These countries are like the perfect examples of nations that basically just said no to this conventional free market advice that developed countries are always pushing. Instead, they use this blend of what Chang calls unorthodox policies to create these really thriving economies.
Okay, now I'm really curious. Let's unpack these unorthodox policies. Let's start with South Korea. What did they do differently?
Well, after the Korean War, South Korea was like totally devastated. But instead of just, accepting their fate and waiting for aid, their government really took control and tried to steer the economy.
So they got involved. That's pretty different from that whole, invisible hand of the free market that we always hear about.
Totally different. They really focused on industrial development, investing a ton in sectors like steel shipbuilding and later on electronics. And they definitely weren't afraid to use tariffs and subsidies to protect their industries from foreign competition.
So they had a plan. It's like they were playing chess, not just, hoping for the best.
Exactly. They were picking winners and supporting them all the way, even if it went against, the popular free market ideas at the time. This wasn't just some random gamble, though. They were really careful about what industries they chose. They picked ones that they thought could drive growth and prosperity in the long term.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about Taiwan? Did they do something similar?
In a lot of ways, yeah. They also had a state-led development model, but they had their own unique approach. They focused a lot on export-oriented industrialization. They created these special economic zones to try to get foreign investment. And they really encouraged the growth of small and medium-sized businesses.
So they knew they couldn't compete with the big players right away, at least not in those heavy industries.
Right. And they also knew how important a skilled workforce would be. So they put a lot of resources into education and infrastructure to create a strong foundation for their economy.
So it sounds like both South Korea and Taiwan, they were really proactive. They were willing to take risks and experiment with policies, but they probably faced some pushback, right? What were some of the challenges that they had to deal with?
Well, they definitely weren't the most popular countries. Among some of the bigger economic powers, they got a lot of pressure, especially from the United States, to liberalize their economies faster and follow the rules of free trade.
So it was kind of like, well, we did it this way, but you can't.
Yeah, something like that. But both South Korea and Taiwan stuck to their guns. They knew that they needed a different approach, and they were willing to play the long game to build up their industries.
And it definitely paid off. I mean, look at them now. They're major players in the global economy. I think it shows that there's no one right way to develop.
For sure. Chang's work really challenges us to think differently about these simple stories we hear about economic development and realize that there are a lot of different paths to success.
Okay, so we've seen how these countries defied the odds and really achieved amazing economic growth. But the world's a lot different now than it was back then. What are some of the new challenges that developing nations are facing today?
Well, for one thing, technology has changed everything. It's moving so fast that it's hard for developing countries to catch up, and even harder to stay competitive. It's like trying to hit a target that keeps moving.
Yeah, it's one thing to learn how to use existing technology, but it's totally different to keep up with all the new innovations. What are some of the other challenges?
Bureaucracy can be a huge obstacle. A lot of developing nations have these inefficient and sometimes corrupt systems that make it hard for new businesses to get started, and they stifle innovation.
You have red tape. I think we've all experienced that at some point. It can really slow things down. And we can't forget about corruption.
Right. Corruption creates an unfair playing field. It makes investors nervous, and it erodes people's trust in the government. It's a major problem that developing nations have to deal with head on if they want to create a more level playing field.
So we've got technology moving so fast, bureaucracy getting in the way, and then there's always this threat of corruption. It sounds pretty tough. Like, for countries that are trying to develop today, I mean, does that make all those lessons from South Korea and Taiwan, useless now?
I don't think so. The specific things they did, those might need to be updated for today's world. But I think the main ideas are still important. It's about understanding that there's not just one way to develop. It's not like there's some magic formula. You have to figure out your own strengths and weaknesses. Be strategic and bold. Don't be afraid to do things your own way, even if it means going against what everyone else is saying.
So don't just listen to those countries that already made it and are now telling everyone else what to do.
Exactly. Developing nations need to be more in control of their own economies, just like South Korea and Taiwan were. They need to try things out, learn from their mistakes, and build institutions that will help them grow in the long run. And they need to be smart about how the world works, understand the history, and not be naive about the challenges they're facing.
It's like we've climbed down from that historical ladder, and now we're at a crossroads, trying to figure out where to go next.
Yeah.
What's the most important thing for our listener to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to think critically. Don't just accept those simple stories about development, the ones that say that free markets will solve everything. Look closer, question things, and consider different points of view.
It's all about connecting the dots, right?
Yeah.
Understanding how things got to be the way they are, and then using that knowledge to make better decisions in the future.
Exactly. And remember, development never really ends. It's an ongoing process of adapting, innovating, and always striving for something better.
This deep dive into kicking away the ladder has been really thought-provoking. It makes you wonder, is Chang being too cynical about global economics? Or is he just giving us a much-needed reality check?
That's a good question, and I think it's up to each person to decide. But I think Chang's work is a call to action. It's a challenge for us to think about these complex issues and try to create a global economy that's more fair and just.
It reminds us that development isn't just about numbers. It's about people,
Absolutely.
their choices, their struggles, and their hopes for a better future.
Well said. And that journey continues, with new chapters being written every day.
And on that note, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep digging deeper into the forces that shape our world. Until next time.